The first warning was not the cloud. It was the quiet. On the morning the Locusts reached Willow Creek Crossing, even the blacksmith's hammer stopped in midair. Horses pulled hard against their traces. Store doors opened and stayed open. Along the western road, men shaded their eyes and stared at a brown shelf rising over the prairie. At first, people called it dust. Then the dust changed direction without wind. It lifted, folded, widened, until it covered the sun in a living stain. The sound followed a moment later, thin at first, then endless. A dry, rasping hiss rolled over the town as if the grass itself had learned to grind its teeth. Families ran for barns. Farmers grabbed sacks, torches, shovels, anything that made a man feel less helpless. Then one wagon turned toward the swarm. Cora Tilling stood on the buckboard, with one boot braced against a crate. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Dust streaked one cheek. Behind her, 8 narrow field cages rattled against each other, each one packed with restless birds. 186 hungry hens. Her dog, Patch, ran beside the wheels, barking at the chickens before they could panic. People shouted for Cora to turn back. Silas Mott, the grain buyer, called her a fool loud enough for half the street to hear. Cora did not look at him. She drove straight to the greenest wheat in the valley, jumped down before the wagon stopped, and pulled the first wooden pin. The door dropped. Feathers burst into the stalks. A second cage opened. Then a third. Hens poured beneath the wheat in a red, black, and white flood, heads low, eyes bright, beaks snapping at the ground that everyone else was trying to save from the sky. Above them, the swarm began to fall. Patch circled the edge. The farmers froze. Cora lifted one hand and gave the strangest order Willow Creek had ever heard during a disaster. Let them land. 9 weeks earlier, nobody in Willow Creek Crossing would have trusted Cora Tilling with a valley. Most of them barely trusted her with her own farm. She came home in late April of 1875 after burying Amos Tilling, the old uncle who had raised her from the age of 6. The funeral ended before noon. By sundown, the last wagon tracks had faded from the yard. What remained was 38 acres of hard Kansas ground. A 2-room house with a sagging porch, a mule named Juniper, a sharp-eyed dog named Patch, and a banknote that sat on the kitchen table as if it owned the place. Beside the note lay Amos's weather ledger. The ledger was not handsome. Its corners had softened from years of hands. The cover had been repaired with shoe thread. Inside were planting dates, moon phases, rain measurements, feed ratios, and the kind of observations no expert ever publishes, because no expert bothers to write them down. Cora wanted to keep that book more than the house. The first visitor, after the funeral, was Silas Mott. He was not a banker, but he carried himself like one. He bought grain, extended credit, and remembered every favor with interest. He stood at the porch rail, looked over the tired fields, and offered to take the property before the bank did. His price was insulting. His timing was worse. Cora said no. Silas smiled without warmth. A woman alone cannot fight weather, debt, and insects all at once. He climbed back into his buggy and left before she could answer. That night, Cora read Amos's ledger by lamplight. Most pages were ordinary. How deep to plant sorghum after a dry winter. How to judge soil crust by the way rain beads on it. Which corner of the pasture held moisture longest? Near the back, one line had been boxed twice. A field is lost long before the swarm arrives. Cora ran her finger under the sentence. Then she turned back several pages and found the notes that explained it. Amos had believed disasters announced themselves quietly. Before hail, there were wind patterns. Before drought, there were roots that stopped reaching. Before insects became a black sky, there were scattered, chewed leaves that honest people ignored because the damage still looked small. The next morning, Cora carried a pencil into the garden. She counted everything. 14 striped beetles on the bean row. 26 cutworms under the young cabbage. Grasshoppers lifting from the ditch 2 weeks earlier than usual. Leaf loss on the north turnips, nearly a quarter. Leaf loss on the south patch, still low but rising. For 7 days she counted. For 7 nights she wrote. The debt was frightening, but debt moved on paper. The insects moved with mouths. By the second week, the numbers had worsened enough to make her stomach tighten. The beans were not growing. They were surviving. The cabbage hearts had begun to look ragged. The garden was supposed to carry them through summer and help pay the note in fall. Instead, it was being collected one bite at a time. Cora rode Juniper into town for lamp oil, salt, and feed, intending to spend as little as possible. At Harlan's store, she heard the noise before she saw the crates. Peeping, scratching, a restless little thunder trapped in pine boxes. The shipment had been meant for a settlement 2 counties north, but a rail clerk had marked it wrong. 214 chicks had arrived in Willow Creek crossing with nobody waiting for them. The storekeeper had kept them warm for 2 nights and was tired of losing sleep. "Take 10, he told Cora. "Take 20. Take the whole cursed choir if you want. I cannot feed a mistake." The price for all of them was $13.60. It was almost everything she had. Most people would have seen frailty, tiny bodies, tiny bones, 100 ways to die before June. Cora saw mouths. Not the hungry mouths threatening her garden. The other kind. The kind Amos's ledger had taught her to respect. Small mouths placed where larger trouble was beginning. She bought the chicks. By dusk, her kitchen had become a barn nursery. Crates lined the wall near the stove. More sat under the table. She stuffed cracks with rags, set shallow saucers of water, warmed bricks, spread straw, and told herself that survival was mostly attention. Patch lay between the crates as if guarding treasure. At sunrise, 17 chicks were dead. Cora did not cry immediately. She stood with one hand on the stove and listened to the surviving chicks pant. The room was hot, but wrong hot. Wet straw clung to the box corners. The air had turned heavy. She had saved the warmth and trapped the breath. The lesson was cruel because it was clear. She carried the dead chicks outside, buried them behind the wash shed, then returned to the kitchen and opened Amos's ledger to a blank page. Her first drawings were ugly. Vent holes, slatted lids, box legs to lift the corners from the cold floor. A method for rotating warm bricks instead of cooking the air all night. By afternoon, she had rebuilt the brooder boxes with scrap wood and wire. That was when Ruth Pender came to the door. Ruth had kept poultry for 40 years, and patience for none of them. She stood in the threshold, looked across the kitchen, and said, "You bought yourself a storm with feet." Then she took off her bonnet and went to work. She showed Cora how to judge a chick by the shine of its eye, how to spot a weak one before it fell behind, how to keep water clean enough to save a flock from its own filth, and why damp straw killed faster than a cold draught. She mixed sour milk into mash for the weakest birds, and told Cora not to confuse fussing with care. "Care has a reason," Ruth said. "Fussing just makes the farmer tired." After that day, Cora's ledger changed. It no longer held only weather and insects. It held chick counts, feed measurements, bedding changes, heat checks, and failures named plainly enough to prevent them from returning. After the first week, 193 chicks remained. 3 days later, 191. Then the deaths slowed. The boxes stayed dry, the birds strengthened. Down gave way to feathers. The kitchen stopped sounding like panic and started sounding like machinery. Willow Creek noticed, of course. A woman cannot buy 200 chicks in a town that small and expect silence. At the pump, they called it Cora's Feather Bank. At church, someone whispered that she had mistaken grief for business. Silas Mott preferred the hen mortgage, which he repeated whenever he passed her fence. Cora did not answer. Answering would not save a cabbage leaf. By early June, the birds were large enough to test in the garden. Cora opened a small gate and expected them to spread through the rows like justice. They spread like trouble. Half-chased beetles, half-chased beans. One bold pullet attacked the lettuce as if it had been hired by the insects. Patch tried to herd them and only made the chaos faster. By noon, Cora had saved several plants from bugs and several more from chickens. It was not a system. It was a comedy with consequences. That evening, she went back to the ledger. Amos had once written about moving pigs through a corn stubble with rope panels. The lesson was not about pigs. It was about boundaries. Loose appetite destroys. Directed appetite works. Cora underlined the sentence until the pencil point broke. The first field cage was too large, too heavy, and too proud of itself. She built it from scrap boards and chicken wire, open on the bottom so the birds could scratch the soil. It took all her strength to drag it across one row. The second version was shorter. The third had runners shaved smooth with a draw knife. The fourth borrowed 2 wheels from a broken laundry cart and moved like an idea that had finally found its legs. She put 12 pullets inside and rolled the cage over the worst cabbage row. The change was immediate. The wire kept the birds where she put them. The open bottom let them hunt. Beetles disappeared first, then cutworms, then young grasshoppers that had been hiding under leaves. When the birds cleared a patch, Cora pulled the cage forward by a few feet. The garden did not need luck. It needed the problem divided into pieces small enough for hungry beaks to finish. By the end of the week, Cora had built 6 moving cages. Patch learned to walk the edges whenever she shifted them. If a bird slipped out, he turned it back with one hard stare. Ruth came twice to inspect the flock and insult the workmanship until it improved. The ledger began to prove what the town would not. Cabbage row 3. 63 beetles on Monday. 9 by Saturday. Turnip leaf loss, 42% in the test bed, 11% after 6 days under cage rotation, bean shoots, recovering, soil crust, softer where birds worked, water absorption after rain, faster. The birds were not only eating pests, they were scratching the surface open and leaving manure behind them. The rows that had passed under the cages greened first after a shower. Plants that looked doomed in May pushed new leaves in June. Cora started calling the cages her walking pens. The name stuck only in her ledger. The town called them bird boxes. Silas Mott laughed until the eggs began. At first there were 5 in a day, then 12, then 21. Ruth helped sort the best layers from the lazy ones. Cora sold eggs in town and wrote every coin into the ledger beside feed costs and fence wire. The numbers were not dramatic. They did not erase the banknote, but they slowed its teeth. A farm rarely survives by one grand rescue. It survives because 10 small leaks are stopped before the floor gives way. By July, other farmers began asking quiet questions. Ezra Lark was the first who did not smirk while asking them. He farmed 29 acres east of the creek with his wife Alma and had already lost one garden to grasshoppers. He watched Cora move a walking pen across her beans and asked how many birds she used per row. Cora did not make a speech. She opened the ledger. Ezra studied the columns. Dates, counts, weather, feed, losses, results. "That's not a trick," he said. "No," Cora answered. "It's work that repeats." He nodded slowly and rode away, looking back more than once. In August, the Prairie began speaking in signs. Grasshoppers thickened along the ditches. Fence posts seemed to flicker when anyone walked near them. The wild sunflowers west of town lost their lower leaves in a day. In the pasture, Cora could take 6 steps and lift a brown burst from the grass each time. She added new pages to the ledger. Wind from the south, dry heat, hopper count high near road, 2 days later, higher. 4 days later, too many to count in the ditch, but not yet in the wheat. Ruth Pender came by with a basket of cracked corn and found Cora measuring damage in the pasture. Ruth did not laugh. "I was a girl in '66, she said. "The ground moved before the sky did." That was all she said, but it was enough. Cora found Amos's oldest entries that night. One passage had been written harder than the rest. The pen pressed so deep it scarred the next page. "When the insects gather on the edges, men still talk about harvest. When they rise together, talk is over." The next morning Cora tried to warn Silas Mott. His wheat was the largest stand in Willow Creek. His fields bordered the west road. If a swarm came, it would likely hit him first. Silas stood at his grain office and listened with the expression of a man being charged for advice he did not order. "You see bugs because you go looking for them," he said. "I see them because they are there." He tapped the side of her ledger with one finger. "Numbers do not scare insects away." "No," Cora said, "but they tell you where to be before they arrive." Silas handed the ledger back and told her he had hired men, smoke pots, and enough burlap to beat the life from any ordinary infestation. Cora almost answered that ordinary was the danger. Instead, she returned home and repaired every latch on every walking pen. 3 mornings later, Ezra Lark saw the western horizon darken. He was fixing a gate when the light changed on the nail in his hand. He looked up and saw what first seemed like smoke beyond Silas Mott's wheat. Then the smoke crawled sideways. By the time Ezra reached town, half of Willow Creek had gathered in the road. Cora arrived with her ledger under one arm. Ruth Pender stood beside the store steps, her mouth drawn thin. Silas Mott was already telling people not to lose their heads. "Dust," he said. "Heat shimmer. Maybe a small flight." Nobody wanted him to be wrong. The cloud widened anyway. The western sky became a moving bruise. Sunlight thinned to a dirty copper. Then the sound arrived, and every comfortable explanation left with it. A hiss, a rasp, millions of bodies rubbing the air raw. Ruth whispered one word. Locusts. The swarm did not fall on Cora's garden first. It chose Silas Mott's wheat, the largest, cleanest, most admired, stand in the valley, vanished under a living sheet. Men ran with smoke pots. The smoke made the locusts lift, turn, and settle 10 yards away. Boys dragged sacks across the heads of wheat until their arms shook. Hired hands shouted and swung boards. Horses bolted from the noise. A few farmers tried burning damp straw along the windward edge and nearly started a field fire. The locusts ate through all of it. By noon, the outer acres had lost their color. Green blades became pale sticks. Wheat heads fell in pieces. The stalks trembled under a weight that was not wind. Silas moved from group to group with a face that no longer knew which order to give. Cora watched from the ridge above the west road. She felt no triumph. A man could be cruel and still be ruined. A field could belong to a fool and still feed a town. The swarm did not care who deserved what. It only cared where the food was. Then Cora looked east. Ezra Lark's farm had not been reached fully yet. There was still time, not much, but enough for something that repeats. She ran home. Juniper pulled the loaded wagon harder than the old mule had any right to pull. 6 walking pens were stacked crosswise. Loose crates filled the middle. Feed sacks lay over water jugs. Patch leaped in and out of the wagon, wild with purpose. Cora reached Ezra's fields as the first wave of locusts dropped into the outer beans. Alma Lark stood on the porch, holding a child on one hip. Ezra met Cora at the fence. "What do you need?" "Hands," Cora said, and no argument. They unloaded the first pen into a row, crawling with grasshoppers and young locusts. Cora opened the crate at one end. 12 hens rushed in as if the field had been set for them. Beaks struck the soil. The sound was small. Then it multiplied. The birds snapped insects from leaves, chased them through the dirt, and swallowed them faster than Ezra could count. Cora pulled the pen forward. Ezra took the next handle. Alma set the child inside and carried water to the field. In 20 minutes, one row changed, not saved forever, not safe, changed. Where the birds had passed, the plants still had leaves. Where they had not, the insects thickened. Ezra knelt and stared at the difference. Cora did not wait for wonder to finish. She opened another crate. By late afternoon, 3 acres had been defended in strips. The swarm still moved. The danger was still enormous. But the proof stood in plain sight. A line between plants that had been guarded and plants that had not. Ezra rode to town with that proof in his voice. People doubted him for almost 5 minutes. Then they looked west at Silas's stripped wheat and east at Ezra's standing rows. Willow Creek Crossing changed its mind the way frightened towns often do, all at once. Children were sent to catch hens. Women packed crates with feed and water. Men dragged old coops onto wagons. Ruth Pender took command of sorting the weakest birds out before they wasted space. Cora stood on a wagon bed and drew field lines in dust on a board. "Do not spread them thin," she told them. "A scattered flock is decoration. A held flock is a tool." By sunset, Willow Creek had gathered nearly every chicken in the township, 1,920 birds. Some were old hens. Some were young pullets. Some were roosters no one had liked before that day. They filled crates, baskets, barrels, laundry boxes, and anything else with air holes. The sound was ridiculous. The purpose was not. For 2 hours, the town fought like a machine built from panic and feathers. Walking pens moved through beans, oats, garden rows, and wheat margins. Wherever locusts settled low, birds tore into them. Wherever the insects thickened, Cora shifted birds in. Ruth rotated tired flocks out. Patch ran the ragged edges until his tongue hung from his mouth. For the first time that day, the swarm did not simply take. Then the wind turned. A hot push came out of the south and rolled over the fields. Dust lifted. The locusts rose with it. All at once the ground emptied. The birds milled below, snapping at air. Above them, the swarm folded upward into a dark, restless ceiling and drifted past the fields they had defended. Farmers lowered their ropes. Children stopped chasing loose birds. A few men looked toward their wagons as if hope had become embarrassing. The chickens could not fight what they could not reach. Cora sat on the wagon step with the ledger bent in her pocket and dust ground into the lines of her hands. For one terrible minute she had no answer. Then Ruth Pender walked to her side. The old woman was watching the swarm, not the field. "They did not leave," Ruth said. "They chose supper." Cora followed her gaze. Beyond the creek lay the bottomland wheat, the heaviest crop still standing in Willow Creek. It grew thick where the soil held moisture. It was green at the base and golden at the head. To a farmer, it looked like survival. To a locust, it looked like a feast. Cora stood so fast the wagon spring creaked. "Load them," she called. "Get ahead of it." The race to the creek bottom became the story Willow Creek told for the rest of its life. Wagons tore down the rutted road with crates banging and feathers whipping through the air. Boys ran behind to grab strays. Ruth shouted bird counts from one wagon to another. Ezra took the north lane. Alma hauled water. Even Silas Mott, white-faced and silent, lifted 2 heavy pens onto Cora's wagon without being asked. No one thanked him. There was no room for ceremony when winter was hanging in the sky. They reached the bottomland, with the swarm still high to the west. Cora placed the birds where the wheat was thickest, not where fear pointed first. She lined walking pens beneath the heads of grain. She ordered loose flocks held inside rope arcs and wagon boards. Water buckets went to the edges. Rest birds waited in crates. Above them, the brown cloud lowered. The hiss grew until speech had to fight for space. Farmers gripped sacks out of habit. Silas reached for a smoke pot. Cora saw it and shook her head. No smoke. He stared at her as if she had gone mad. Cora looked across the wheat, across the birds, across the faces waiting for a woman they had mocked to tell them when to move. "Let them land," she said. Every instinct in the field rebelled. A locust swarm was not something you welcomed. It was something you ran from, struck at, cursed, smoked, chased, prayed against. Letting it fall felt like opening the door to ruin. But the town held. The first locusts hit the wheat. Then the next 1,000. Then the sky began to empty. For a heartbeat, the brown layer formed on the heads of grain. Then the ground answered. The hens surged upward through the stalks. Beaks snapped locusts from leaves before they could settle. Roosters leaped into the lower heads and came down, shaking insects in their bills. Pullets chased the ones that dropped into the rows. The birds were not defending the wheat from the swarm. They were feeding on the swarm before it could feed. "Move with the fall," Cora shouted. She grabbed a pen handle and pulled. Ezra took the next. Silas took another. Soon the line shifted yard by yard, always beneath the thickest descent. Where the swarm bunched, Cora sent fresh birds. Where the birds slowed, Ruth changed them out. Patch drove strays back under the crop. The battle was not clean. It was mud, dust, wings, clawed hands, spilled water, broken crates, and farmers coughing through insect husks. It was children crying from fear, and then laughing because a fat rooster refused to stop eating. It was Alma Lark binding Cora's split palm with a strip of apron, while Cora kept giving orders. Hour after hour the field held. Not all of it. Some edges were stripped. Some rows went ragged. But the heart of the bottomland wheat remained standing, because the swarm never got the one thing it needed: time. At sunset, the locust cloud broke. It did not vanish. Disasters rarely do. It thinned, separated, and lifted east in ragged bands that no longer darkened the whole sky. Behind it lay damage, but not emptiness. The creek wheat stood in rows of gold and green. Ezra's field stood in guarded strips. Cora's garden stood. Even parts of Silas Mott's remaining east field had been saved by birds he had spent all summer mocking. The chickens, full beyond dignity, sat under the wheat like sacks of warm grain. No one cheered at first. The quiet was too large. Silas Mott walked to Cora with his hat crushed in one hand. Dust and insect pieces clung to his coat. The man who had priced her land before offering sympathy could barely meet her eyes. "I was wrong," he said. Cora looked at the standing wheat, then at the exhausted birds, then at the people waiting to see whether the moment would become revenge. It did not. "There will be eggs to collect tomorrow," she said, "and fields to check." The next spring, nearly every farm in Willow Creek Crossing had walking pens. Some were crooked. Some rolled badly. Ruth called half of them insults to carpentry. But they worked. Families kept insect ledgers beside weather ledgers. Children learned to count grasshoppers before they learned long division. Farmers rotated flocks by agreement, moving birds to trouble spots before the trouble found wings. Reverend Finch wrote the arrangement into the church record after harvest. The town called it the Feather Line. Silas Mott paid fair price for eggs that year and stopped making jokes about hens. Cora never pretended the chickens had saved the valley by magic. Magic would have been easier to explain and less useful to remember. What saved Willow Creek was a woman who counted when other people guessed. A flock placed before panic. A system built from dead chicks, damp straw, broken wheels, bitter laughter, and repeated work. On a clear morning 1 year after the swarm, Cora stood at her fence with Amos's ledger open in her hands. Patch slept in the shade. Juniper cropped grass near the wash shed. In the garden, a line of hens moved through a walking pen, small heads dipping and rising in steady rhythm. Near the back of the ledger, beneath Amos's old warning, Cora wrote one sentence of her own. A disaster is only sudden to the people who refuse to count its footsteps.